I always tell people that I don't. How many of you read the autobiography or biography of Sam Walton? Anybody? A few in the room? Okay, it's almost like required reading. Once I moved here, somebody just gave me a copy. But no, seriously, I actually had a copy before that. What I didn't know was something that I got intimately familiar with over maybe the last 5 or 6 years, which was the role that the Northwest Arkansas Council has played in this community. And it was all born out of, I can just imagine what the room was like, where you had J.B. Hunt, Don Tyson, and Sam Walton all in a room together talking about what do we want this place to be down the road, for not just for our kids, but for our kids' kids and their kids. And so I think it was that foresight that we're all actually benefiting from right now. You may not realize it, but we are. And part of what we're benefiting from are from programs like Groundworks, which Duke McClarty is running there at NeighborWorks, and he does an amazing job. And I've had a chance to work with he and Isabel and the rest of their amazing team. And NeighborWorks is an outstanding organization, but I think they spend, I said NeighborWorks, Northwest Arkansas Council. NeighborWorks is another good organization. But the Northwest Arkansas Council, they work judiciously behind the scenes to look at ways to make Northwest Arkansas better. And this is one simple example of what we're about to see. And so I really want to just give it up for Nathan Dugan, State Senator Forrest Mandeville, and Duke McClarty from Northwest Arkansas Council. The session is the Montana Miracle, prioritizing zoning reforms to unlock housing opportunities. You guys buckle up. This is going to be a good session. Come on up.
Thank you, Randy.
As always.
Randy has set the bar, I guess, appropriately high. Good afternoon. My name's Duke McClarty. For those of you that I have not met, I'm the Executive Director of Groundwork, Workforce Housing for Northwest Arkansas. Groundwork mission is to provide strategic regional leadership and expertise to strengthen communities by expanding housing options for those in our workforce, near employment, commercial, and cultural centers in Northwest Arkansas. We're excited to lead this important discussion today. Hopefully it inspires, it shares some new ideas. And before we begin, I want to take a quick moment to thank Megan, I'm not sure where she is, Wes, the ULI team for their partnership, and we appreciate you for providing the space for this discussion. With that, we're going to start with a brief video that's going to just kind of summarize the conditions in Montana that led to the Montana Miracle, and then we'll dig into those details.
Montana is an amazing place to live. We're one of the few places left in the world where you can be working at your office job and get off of work and then 15, 20 minutes later be on, the mountain bike path or be hiking up the end behind me. One of the problems is that we place so many constraints around building homes to accommodate the people who want to live here that it's making it tough for regular folks to actually live in this great place.
And I really worry about my kids and about the young folks who move to town and how they're not going to have the opportunities to build their lives in the same way that I have.
The lack of housing is changing the demographics of the city, and in many cases is pushing people out of the city.
Not only does it make the town a little bit less vibrant, but I feel like the community is weakening as well.
Zoning as a concept was originally created to separate dirty or toxic industry and clean places for people to live.
But what it's actually become is the government dictating all aspects of property owners' rights.
The effect has been, in many cases, to exclude opportunity for new members to join the community, and it's done that by restricting the supply of available housing, which has resulted in an increase in housing costs.
We have a lot of different ranging zoning restrictions across the state, but they're all consistent in the fact that they're zoning out the middle market.
Things like duplexes, townhomes, triplexes, they're missing because governments have instituted strict local zoning regulations that have effectively prohibited these sorts of homes from vast portions of our communities.
Density is how we all get to live in the same place and all have the same opportunities. certainly it affects the people at the bottom of the income scale the very most.
We're not creating opportunities for any of those people that we need to run our cities. And by not being able to create homes for all people at all income levels, we're really doing ourselves a disservice.
The idea of potentially having to leave Montana because of rising housing costs is devastating to me. This is where I grew up. This is my home.
People are moving where they can afford to live at this point. You can go anywhere in this state and see a help wanted sign.
That's one of the amazing discoveries that we've found since we've started the Montana Zoning Atlas project, is that there's this area of agreement between, oftentimes the far left and the far right on this issue. From a conservative point of view, it's about rights. It's about property rights. It's the right to use your property in a way that maximizes its value to your community.
If you're on the left like me, you should support zoning reform because it's the single greatest thing that we have direct control over to solve climate change.
If we're gonna protect Montana's environment, we're gonna have to grow inward in these urban areas rather than sprawling out into the counties. We're all gonna have to give a little. It means that we're gonna have to embrace new neighbors and embrace a mix of socioeconomic backgrounds in our neighborhoods. Otherwise, Montana's just gonna become an expensive gated community that only the wealthy can live in.
If we tried in earnest and we really implemented some serious zoning reforms at the local and state levels, we would go a long way to addressing our housing crisis in Montana.
In the past, it has seemed unthinkable to get the really substantive change that we need to zoning, but everybody is waking up to how much it is holding us back, how many opportunities aren't available to us because of our restrictive zoning. A really healthy, sustainable, resilient community is one that has a place for everybody.
So with that historical framing, with that understanding of the why, I'd like our guests to introduce themselves. And if you could, please include in your introduction kind of your why. Why did you get involved in this issue? And I'll start with Nathan.
Sure, yeah, I'm Nathan Dugan. I'm a co-founder and the president of an organization called Shelter WF, or Shelter Whitefish. We formed back in April of 2022 to really just combat some of the NIMBY, not in my backyard attitudes that we saw in City Hall. And we were able to get involved at the state level a lot earlier and at a larger capacity than I feel like we ever dreamed of, just because the governor established a task force to kind of address this, and I was fortunate to get appointed to that. So we ramped up really quick with that. I do this as a volunteer in my spare time and like a few hours a week, and our whole board is pretty much volunteer as well. I'm a home health physical therapist by day, and I think my why relates to Montana's getting older, Whitefish is getting older, and that's directly related to housing costs. You can go to other states nearby, make a decent amount more money, and buy a house that's affordable, or like have more affordable rent. And so that's my why, because quite honestly, I just want more friends in town, right? But being a home health physical therapist, I see it every day. Like, our houses are not set up for us to age in, and people don't have options. Yeah. There are no options for people to downsize in Montana, and most of Montana. And so that's another big reason as well.
I appreciate that. Senator Forrest Vanderbilt, what's your why?
Yeah, thanks. First, I want to thank Duke and your team for having me out here, and want to thank all of you for being here. It's a great opportunity to come and share a little bit about what we've been doing in Montana. I've been in the state legislature off and on for about 10 years now, working on land use and planning issues. My day job, I am a planner, so I do have my AICP certification and all that fun stuff. So when I'm not up making laws, I am practicing the laws and telling people what they can and can't do based on the zoning, whether or not I agree with it. What we're seeing in Montana, kind of like what Nathan mentioned, is an aging population. We fund our local governments completely on property taxes. School districts, cities, counties are funded by property tax. So we're seeing people that have spent their entire lives and for generations in Montana being taxed out of their homes. And as our property values, our home values increase, that just leads keeps the problem going. And to create opportunities for accessory dwelling units, for duplexes, for people to age in place by being able to rent out a garage apartment, something like that. Talking to people about their kids being able to move back to Montana and continue that generational Montana living is important. And I say that as someone who was born and raised in Montana. My dad was born and raised in Montana. My grandpa was born and raised in Montana. So we have that generational tie to the community. And I want to make sure that that can continue without being overly restrictive and just saying, no, you can't come.
Right. I really appreciate that. So now that we've kind of covered the why, I'd like to jump ahead and actually highlight what was accomplished and then maybe back into the how. So Senator Mandeville, if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to click through a few slides here. Let's start with that one. I saw a quote of yours where you really talked about, the opportunity that you sensed there was, the ability to thread this needle and actually advance this. Can you talk a little bit about the opportunity and then get into exactly what was eventually passed and done?
Yeah, thanks for the question, because everyone knew there was an issue in Montana. It wasn't some secret that we were going out looking for a solution to something that didn't exist. Everyone knew this was happening. Planners realized this was happening 6 years ago and have been saying, we have an issue, what's the solution? One of the problems was we never really had the coalition to get anything done. So we ended up with a great situation where we had industry on board, realtors, developers were on board, the practitioners, planners were on board, cities and counties understood something had to happen. We had legislators that could see that something needed to happen. Governor Gianforte had just come into office and realized there was a salient issue that needed to be addressed. So we had all of these organizations, all of these people pull in the same direction. And the governor created the housing task force. We had strong Republican majorities in the House and Senate. And we knew that if we were on the same page, if we sold this right,
correct,
we could get some good stuff done.
And what was done?
Oh, what wasn't done might be an easier question. We rewrote our entire planning code statewide in one way, shape, or form. We tried to do a lot more by right development, by preempting some local zoning. We tried to get more administrative in our reviews instead of one at a time, lots of duplicative public hearing processes. We tried to get around that. We tried to put a lot of the emphasis on long-range planning and zoning, and a lot of the front-loading the public comment process instead of back-loading it. We increased exemptions to various administrative rules and state laws. So we tackled the issue head on. We did have there were some pushbacks and there were some compromises we had to make, and we didn't get everything that we had maybe set out to do, but you never would have seen this 10 years ago, even 4 years ago.
That's great. Nathan, can you, Senator Mandeville touched on it a little bit, but kind of the coalition building that had to take place. Can you elaborate and share a little bit more on the strategies that were deployed to build those bridges?
Yeah, we knew it was going to be super important to have a coalition that could speak to basically every legislator in the legislature to make sure that we had the votes to pass all this stuff, and more importantly, to have the votes to get it all out of committee, because it doesn't get out of committee, it doesn't get to the floor, and it doesn't get to a vote, even if it's broadly popular. So we started early setting up a coalition that included folks from basically every political persuasion. You can see some of them on the screen. So Americans for Prosperity, the Frontier Institute were more of those kind of right-wing thought leaders. From the left, it was us, Shelter WF. Forward Montana, which I think it's an organization of younger people, and I think historically can trigger a lot of Republican legislatures. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
But to speak to some of the Democrats, like, it's really important to hear from them, as well as the Associated Students of the University of Montana, ASUM. We also involved, some other groups that were not necessarily partisan: Blackfeet Nation and Red Medicine LLC, the North Missoula Community Development Corporation, Montana Women Vote, NeighborWorks Montana, the Montana Association of Realtors. They all played varying roles. I think the coalition was led by the Frontier Institute, as well as Shelter WF, with a lobbyist there in Helena. But we knew it was going to be important to be able to speak to every legislator on the committees and in the House, and that worked out pretty well.
That's great. I'd like to highlight here, these are the vote totals for some of the votes on this legislation, and you can just see the overwhelming support that was received with this legislation. Senator Mandeville, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of how those discussions occurred? I mean, from legislator to legislator.
Yeah, we really did our homework on this, and like Nathan mentioned, there was a coalition that involved both the right and the left. There was definitely some strategy. Sometimes you want, so we had super majority Republicans in both the House and the Senate. There's sometimes where it's beneficial to not have a left-leaning organization come in and tell a bunch of us Republicans to vote for it, because that is triggering somewhat. And sometimes you don't want a right-leaning organization. You're not going to send Americans for Prosperity to go talk to the Democrats about how great something is. So we were really able to do our homework with the different legislators. The committee setup was, it couldn't have been better for some of these reforms, especially on the Senate side, where we had a lot of younger millennial legislators on the local government committee that were hearing these bills first and passing them over to the House. And then we were able to hold a lot of House bills hostage to make sure that these reform bills that we were working on were passed.
That's interesting. So there was a whole campaign centered around quote unquote California style zoning. What role did this campaign play in the ultimate success? And was this an appropriate rally cry statewide? I'll start with Nathan.
Yeah, let's speak briefly on this. I think that Senator Mandeville might have more insight on this, but this was kind of something that was coined by the Frontier Institute. Kendall Cotton came up with this. I'll admit, when I first saw it, I was like, that's kind of weird. I don't know if that's going to be very effective, but single-family zoning was invented in Berkeley, California in like the early 1900s. So it is true in a way. And yeah, I assume that it worked fairly well. It certainly didn't hurt. But maybe you can speak more to how Republican legislators heard that message.
Yeah, we don't like California style anything. So if it's California style, we'll get rid of that about as quickly as we can.
Are you running for office here?
Yeah, I think it's kind of one of those universal rallying cries that no one likes Californians, right?
Thinking back, we now have kind of an understanding of the what. I mean, ADUs are legalized statewide. Duplexes, am I correct? It's statewide in single-family zoned areas?
Roughly. So ADUs are legalized in cities statewide, cities over 5,000, I believe. ADUs is for all cities, not all counties though, which is a bill I'll bringing next session to expand that to counties as well. Duplexes is legalized in all single-family zones in cities over 5,000, and then we, from some of the bigger cities and the bigger counties, have to revise their entire planning and zoning code to really focus on long-range planning, which would give by right development if you're following what was planned in the plan, believe it or not.
So, here in Northwest Arkansas, we're confronting a lot of these similar or same challenges. I've watched that video and I've replaced Montana with Northwest Arkansas. It's like my standard talking points. What were some of the lessons learned that you'd like to leave us with as we grapple with these growth issues, as we think about what's next? Nathan, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a cross-partisan issue, and the longer I do this, it's really a generational issue. There are some people in the boomer generation that kind of understand, but I'd say by and large, that's not the case. Millennials and Gen Z who are trying to enter the housing market for the first time realize that it's very difficult and generally support this stuff a lot more. So, but yeah, it's a cross-partisan issue that breaks more along generational lines than political ideologies. And so that wide coalition is really needed to push these reforms forward. Having that wide coalition also may lead to better incentives and outcomes on those bills because it's not falling into something that is just a political ideology that may be going too far in one direction or the other and not result in the intended outcomes. We learned that it's super important as well to start early. Like you want to start as early as you can before the legislative session. I was talking to Senator Mandeville about this a little bit earlier, but one thing I've come to appreciate in Montana is that we have a legislative session every other year. And so that gives us a lot of time to plan things in between without having to constantly run on the hamster wheel of participating in legislative sessions and like having bills actually going through. As an all-volunteer organization, like that's appreciated by us for sure. Using lobbyists is super helpful. We're about 4 hours away from Helena, which is up a road next to a lake that's 2 lanes with deer all over the place and over a mountain pass in the middle of winter. So having a lobbyist based in Helena allowed us to talk to legislators a lot more than we would have otherwise. Right. And it's important to use local groups to lead the charge. One of the bills that failed early on was a minimum lot size bill that was brought forward, and the Frontier Institute managed that bill and managed the hearing for that bill, and they brought in kind of some out-of-state experts, one of them from California YIMBY, and I don't think that went over super well. And so we certainly had some help from some national organizations. The Welcoming Neighbors Network was really helpful to us in doing things, but they were really behind the scenes, never known about publicly, I guess. And that's really important to take that support if it's available, because it increases capacity, but the local groups should be the ones getting the face time and doing all the work on the ground.
That's great. Senator Mandeville, in a prep call, some of these lessons that were mentioned on that call really stood out to me. And it was really these first two: take what you can get and know when you lost an issue and move on. Can you tease those out a little bit?
Yeah, so the strong Republican majorities in Montana meant that there was some stuff that wasn't going to happen, right? We actually banned inclusionary zoning in Montana in 2021. So there wasn't going to be a bunch of money thrown at the issue, right? And we knew that. So we really focused on the supply side thing, on the property rights angle. It was not we're going to do percentages of development towards affordable housing. We weren't going to create government-run land trusts. We weren't going to do government-owned housing in a lot of places. We did not do, I had people tell me that the Land Use Planning Act was one of the big bills, and I carried that. And I did have people tell me, well, this does not include a climate action plan, so it's useless. We weren't going to pass a climate action plan in Montana. Right. That was never going to happen. So you have to realize who's voting on this and who's signing the bills, who's carrying the bills. And so there was a lot of give and take in realizing the political structure. So you had to really focus on what you could get, the ADUs, the multifamily housing. Also, we did a lot of compromising. Mm-hmm. So we originally wanted to apply a lot of this to counties until we had some counties come in and say, we're not going to zone. We are not going to zone wide swaths of rural agricultural land. Mm-hmm. Our constituents aren't going to let us. So we exempted counties from a lot of these bills.
That's interesting. Was there a moment kind of in this process for each of you that it went from a great idea to felt like something that was realistic? And if you wouldn't mind sharing when that was, I'll start with you, Senator.
Yeah, absolutely. So like I had mentioned, the planners had kind of been kicking around a bill or an idea. It wasn't really a bill for several years. And had a bunch of people working on it, and there was general consensus, but it wasn't really hammered out. And I remember calling Kelly Lynch, who's the director of the Montana League of Cities and Towns, and she had worked on the bill, and I said, Kelly, if we're going to do this, we need to do it now. Mm-hmm. This is the opportunity, so let's get this thing hammered out, figured out, and let's run it. And then we started drafting that, and I had another senator tell me, we're going to kill it. Counties don't like it. We're going to kill it. And so we had to kind of pivot, make some of those changes. But those are two moments that really stood out in exactly how far we could go with some of these reforms if we were willing to move forward, to run with it, and willing to make those changes on the run.
Nathan, to you, was there a tipping point moment, maybe when someone joined the coalition you didn't expect, or just a key conversation in hindsight that really turned that corner?
I mean, I think the tipping point was Governor Gianforte in establishing the housing task force and the two reports that came out of that prior to the session with a lot of basically legislative ideas. As well as what local governments might be able to do to kind of fix some of this stuff on their own was the focus of the second report. But in hindsight, I think that was the tipping point because it really kicked off a pretty robust conversation and made it obvious that this session was going to focus around housing, and largely it did, or it felt like it. I mean, obviously there were most bills introduced ever, so there were a lot of other bills, but the whole time it felt like it was going to focus around the housing issue.
How's it been received? I mean, you're sitting in Arkansas talking about it, so you've certainly gotten some attention, but are you starting to see, projects come through the planning process? I know there's been some lawsuits filed. If you wouldn't mind giving the update on some of those efforts. But generally, how's it been sold and received in Montana?
I think it's gone pretty well. We did get sued by an organization called MAID, or Montanans Against Irresponsible Densification. Because obviously the only people that should have houses are the people that can afford maids. We had several of these bills were scheduled to go into effect last January 1st, and they were held up by a judge. So fortunately, the Supreme Court, the Montana Supreme Court said, you know what, you actually have to prove damage beyond, I'm afraid of that my neighbor might move their grandmother into their upstairs apartment.
The horror.
We had some of these NIMBY complaints And there have been some, I have heard from some of the communities that have gone through these zoning updates that it's been a bit cumbersome here and there. But honestly, for the most part, I think there's been a good consensus that these are good changes, needed changes. If it took the legislature to kind of shove some city councils in the right direction, I think it was absolutely worth it. Lewistown is a town of about 5,000 people in the middle of Montana that have they have a big German vacuum manufacturing firm moving into town, which is going to bring in 400 jobs. So they're really seeing some of this this growth on the horizon, and they've taken they've really jumped into these reforms with both feet, taking a proactive stance to getting these updated. And that's one of the success stories is rural towns seeing the value in these zoning reforms.
That's great. Getting to the rural towns, Nathan, can you speak to how it's been received in Whitefish? And maybe give us a little context of what Whitefish looks like, what size, demographics.
Yeah, I think it's less rural town versus more urban town in that sense. And I think it is more based on the wealth and status of the town. So Whitefish is a ski town, increasingly like Aspen or Jackson, of about 9,000 people outside of Glacier National Park. I would say among people that come to city council meetings or other functions at City Hall, it's not been very well received. But the same thing goes in Bozeman, which is one of Montana's largest cities. And basically you see the same complaints from folks in Bozeman. Whitefish and Bozeman are very similar for some reason, despite Bozeman being 5 times larger than Whitefish. And so those two cities have not handled it super well. I think that the rest of the state, I just haven't seen as much complaining, I guess. I will call it complaining because it's really just like complaining about the things that the state has done, and the sky still hasn't fallen in Whitefish. And honestly, there have been like 5 ADUs that have been built or permitted since the law went into effect. And Whitefish changed their ordinance well in advance of the Supreme Court overturning the preliminary injunction on that bill. So I think a lot of that is unfounded.
Are you framing 5 as success? Like 5 ADUs?
No.
Okay.
No, not at all. But I think people were like worried they were going to pop up everywhere and be short-term rentals, and clearly not the case. Yeah. And so the opposition to the bills, I think, was a little bit unnecessary. Yeah. But yeah, it's really just Whitefish and Bozeman that are leading the charge against it. We did intervene in the lawsuit, and the district court judge allowed us to intervene as interveners to support all the bills and try to fight that lawsuit. So we're going through that process right now, which is interesting and a good learning experience. But yeah, still working on it.
That's great. You're still working on that, Senator Mandeville. What lies ahead? You took what you could get. You found some compromise. Is the coming legislative agenda, does it include some things that maybe got left on the cutting room floor?
Yeah, and just through the legislative process, there's stuff you miss. So I do want to address some of the stuff that has been complicated as we go through the implementation and try to fix some of that. I do want to take a run at addressing some of the legal challenges that have come up and just make sure that we have crossed all our T's and dotted all of our I's. I'd mentioned the city-county dichotomy a little bit about how counties were able to get out of a lot of these bills. I'd like to take another run at counties and apply some of this to counties. I think one of the issues was that we with the Land Use Planning Act, that big bill that I carried, it would have applied to the entire county. It was in or out 100%. I'd like to make it more of a counties can opt in part of their jurisdiction, and so hopefully that'll make it a little more palatable, and we'll be able to address some of these issues where the issues really popping up.
We'll open it up for questions in just a minute. Randy's 10 more minutes. Perfect. Nathan, what's next for Shelter Whitefish?
We retained our lobbyist through the entire interim, and he's going to be on board with us again. So we have some concepts for some things we want to try to address, some things that were taken out last time in some of those bills, hopefully. Just some small tweaks. There's some things that need tweaked based on the lawsuit, I think, and Senator Mandeville is working on that as well, just to kind of invalidate some of the arguments that were made that were definitely weaker arguments, or to tie back into other state statutes some of the arguments that they made. So we've got some other bills that we want to clean a few things up, just where we're seeing cities kind of skirt the rules. Whitefish is pretty good at that. So tightening some stuff up there. We want to look at taking a shot at parking minimums as well, in some form. Haven't figured that out quite yet, but because of it, SB 382, I guess cities are also going through updating their comprehensive plans.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're doing a lot of work locally as well. All 3 cities in our county are subject to having to update those plans and subject to SB 382. And so we're doing a lot of local focus right now as well, just to make sure that implementation goes well and that they are following the spirit of the law and not just the letter of the law.
With that, let's open it up to questions.
Hi, thank you guys. I would argue that Northwest Arkansas cities are doing a good job with making positive steps towards rezoning in the legislature. Fayetteville has a 71B corridor rezone, 8-story mixed use. Springdale has an elect-in form-based code in the downtown area. Rogers just did a complete redo. We now have transect zoning, which allows for more density, and Bentonville is also evaluating some form-based code. But the big but is the NIMBYism.
Mm-hmm.
And because our city councils are elected, these projects are coming through planning and city council, and because they are purporting more density, but they're in compliance with the code, there's a lot of pushback from planning and from city council. So do you guys have any very tactical solutions for dealing with the NIMBYism?
So I've always maintained that planning is innately political. And there's a lot of people that, in my professional experience, like to say, I'm not political, I'm a planner. And that doesn't work because, like you mentioned, city councils, county commissioners are elected officials. The number one goal of an elected official is to stay elected. If you're a city councilman and you have a bunch of your constituents complaining about something, you're likely to listen to them. And then celebrate the wins.
Mm-hmm.
Like you mentioned, that several municipalities around here are doing great things. Own that, celebrate it, brag about it. Say this is what we did when we had this mixed use development, and this is what's come out of it. We should do more of them. Why not at least allow it?
That's right.
I'll add on to that as well. I think this is the case for state level action because it levels the playing field initially. In any region, and in Northwest Montana, Whitefish is the bad actor here. Like they hope that all the housing will get built in some of the other cities like Kalispell and Columbia Falls, where people can commute 25 minutes or 15 minutes. And so we're not doing our share. Something like 75% of our workforce commutes in every day from out of town. And so without state level action, there's always going to be challenges in the region, in any given region, because all the cities aren't on a level playing field. State level action doesn't solve that, but setting some baseline standards is certainly helpful.
Thank you. Are we far enough removed from the bills passing to be at a point where anyone who was opposed during the process has now come around and said, oh, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be?
I don't think so, especially with an ongoing court case and a preliminary injunction against the ADU bill and the duplex bill that was just overturned like 2 months ago by the Supreme Court. there hasn't been a lot of movement in many cities. I know that we've seen some things get passed or get permitted in Whitefish that would not have been without SB 245, the bill that allows multifamily and mixed use in commercial zones, for instance. But I think that people that were concerned initially probably are still pretty concerned. Yeah, there hasn't been enough time to pass to really build anything.
Yeah, I think we're getting there. One of the concerns that I heard from planners was that it's going to cost $500,000 or more to update our zoning code. And no, it's not. But now that some of those communities have gone through the RFP process and actually have an idea of what it's going to cost to get some of these plans updated, I think that's taken some of that argument away. We also did put in some planning grants to help communities pay for those changes. So it's just making sure that those grants continue to be available and used appropriately, I think helps. But also as we get more into the process, I do think the opposition does dissipate a little bit, but not completely. You know, with planning, there's always someone that says, you should have done this, or I could have done it better.
In the back.
Hi. Like Duke mentioned, those 5 ADUs you didn't consider successful. Now that you've put all of this work into getting these things passed, what do you consider success now, having gone through it and having all of these challenges come out of it? What is your next point? What does success look like from this point?
I mean, I think success from our perspective means actually getting some homes built. There's some economic headwinds, I think, that are contributing that maybe weren't there when the session started, that is making that difficult. The rise in popularity in Montana during COVID has kind of waned as well, and so I think that in Kalispell, the town, city directly to our south, they are actually having to like drop rents on multifamily apartment buildings because they were building a lot more before, and they basically overbuilt for the demand when people had to return back to work and that sort of thing. So, but I think success is going to be actually getting some units on the ground and having cities update their comprehensive plans, and then that's probably what will catalyze a lot of success once we get to a point where zoning is updated based on those plans, and then things can be approved more administratively without so many public hearings subject to NIMBYism.
Another question? Philip. She's coming.
So, Senator, you mentioned, I believe, the municipal associations, you had support of that. But from a municipal standpoint, we're always concerned about state legislature taking over local control, right? Losing local control. So was there any pushback from the municipalities? Was there arguments of, you know, we want to keep our local control within the city and state, get out of our way?
Yes, there absolutely was a lot of pushback from the local governments. I think we were able to temper some of that by including the League of Cities and Towns early in the discussion. They still did oppose a lot of the zoning preemption bills as an overreach of the state legislature. I do believe that they kind of saw the writing on the wall that something was going to happen, so they did get behind one or two of the bills and say, hey, we are at least somewhat supportive. But actually, the League of Cities and Towns is also an intervener in the Made lawsuit. They were granted the ability to intervene. Yes, there was pushback, but I think by working with them, we were able to keep that at as minimum as we could.
Yeah, and the theme of the League of Cities and Towns, and I guess the cities and towns themselves by extension, throughout the session was, we've got this SB 382, the rewrite of zoning, so like we don't need to do this one, we don't need to do this one, we don't need to do this one, like just wait for that one, was kind of the theme in all those hearings for all those other bills.
We wanted to, I guess to add to that, we did pass everything, but we didn't want to create a situation where those bills died, and then 382 went down as well. So we wanted to pass wholesale changes regardless of what happened elsewhere.
Any other questions? Yep.
One of the things I was noticing in Northwest Arkansas is that a lot of the density planning that's going on generates traffic issues. And I'm just wondering how you address the balance between density and traffic.
I think in Montana, we're somewhat lucky because we don't have very sprawling cities at this point. And so that was a goal of mine and a goal of Shelter WF was to create that density in a way that it can enable mass transit, public transit, whether that be light rail, buses. That was the intent behind SB 245, which allows that multifamily and mixed use housing in commercial zones. I don't know if I have a good answer to your question. I think that just generally throughout the U.S., and I'm sure it's true here in Northwest Arkansas, we need more options for people. A lot of people are forced to get in their cars and become traffic when they wouldn't necessarily choose to. That's my answer. It's probably not a good one, but.
Well, sprawl creates more traffic issues than density. So we've seen a lot of 5, 10, 20 acre lots being created along county roads in Montana. And you have to drive if that's the neighborhoods you're living in. And if that's the neighborhood you're living in, if that's the only neighborhoods that are being created. So by allowing the ability to create density, you're going to address those traffic issues as well. Everything's kind of related in planning and development. If you do one thing, you're going to create another issue or solve another issue. You have to take a real holistic approach at everything.
That's great. One final question.
So at the local level, how do you let's say you just want to build an ADU for your aging parents. How do you make it easier for individuals to do that kind of at the local level? Like someone who's not experienced in development or anything like that.
You got to start going to council meetings, and you got to get your friends to go to council meetings, and you just got to talk about it, because the fact of the matter is that like 3 people control what happens in your town, because the squeaky wheel gets the grease. They go and they just talk to the council about everything and all of their grievances, and councilors tend to think that when they hear something over and over again, they think that that is the prevailing opinion, when I guess in fact like most people have the opposite opinion, or they just don't care. And so that's why we formed, because that's what we noticed happening in Whitefish, is like 3 people that were just driving all the decisions that the council made. And so we started showing up to counteract that, and we've seen a lot of changes swing in our direction. And even the people that were showing up before to complain about everything and try to push things in an opposite direction have started like co-opting our language to try to sound more reasonable. So, but yeah, you have to start showing up at the local level. Counselors, I think, generally are very responsive to the people that show up in the room.
Yeah, I've told developers I work with that I have never seen a subdivision or a development application where all of the neighbors show up and say, "This is a great idea. Well, I wish you had done this sooner. Can you add some density? This is awesome." Never happens, right? So having the advocates show up, just assuming people are going to come out against a project, and then having the people show up that say, "No, this is needed because it allows my parents to age in place, because it allows my children to move home." Telling those stories, making that case to the elected official is powerful.
Thank you so much. Keeping with this theme, in the final couple minutes here, Groundworks really excited to announce our GROW policy agenda. These are going to be 4 broad principles that Groundwork is going to encourage our municipalities to work towards: guide zoning, removing barriers, organized partnerships, and welcome advocacy. all of these were represented in today's discussion. This is a living document. It's going to change. It's going to adapt. But the goal is for it to serve as a North Star for housing development in our region as it continues to grow. We invite you to scan the QR code, get our Grow policy agenda on your phone. There's a lot more details in this document, and look forward to working with each of you to get them implemented. Let's thank our guests.